A repository anywhere affects us all. Again, we're talking initially 77,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste moving from every state in the nation to one location. One accident. One terrorist attack. It won't take much to contaminate for thousands of years very large portions of this country.
The repository has gone through an extensive scientific evaluation, the site itself. Over 20 years, several $1 billion, and all of the science being looked at.
If you were in the area, you saw these volcanic cones, why would you ever think it could be compatible with the long-term disposal of nuclear waste?
If this material is brought to Nevada and put in Yucca Mountain, the value is enormous. Some 95% of the energy is still contained in those so-called spent fuel rods. It's crazy to think of it as waste. It's worth billions. I see it as a new Fort Knox.
Located 1,000 feet below the Nevada desert lies a proposed solution to America's energy crisis. Here at Yucca Mountain, the United States government hopes to store the nation's high-level radioactive waste in a geological repository lasting at least 10,000 years. Opponents argue it's an atomic time bomb that someday will trigger a cataclysmic event of unimaginable proportions. Nevada, Las Vegas, synonymous with sin and vice, is only 100 miles away from the planned repository. If an accident did occur, it could possibly affect 1 million residents and visitors alike. This time, however, what happens in Vegas would not stay there. The radiation would enter the jet stream and carry the destruction across the globe. There is no telling how many people could be affected. Tasked with building the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository, the U.S. Department of Energy is putting safeguards in place to prevent any disasters and help make nuclear a viable option to the nation's energy dilemma.
The Congress has decided that we are going to build a repository, that we are going to have a repository program to put our spent nuclear fuel, and the site to be evaluated and licensed for that repository is Yucca Mountain in Nevada. And so I took this job to move the repository program forward so that nuclear can be a viable option for this country.
1 out of every 5 light bulbs in America is lighted with nuclear-generated electricity. 20% of the power in America comes from it. It's safe, it's clean, and it is certainly our future.
Of the 104 fully licensed nuclear reactors in the United States, most are pressurized water reactors. Pressurized water reactors use nuclear fission to heat water under pressure within the reactor. This water is then circulated through a heat exchanger called a steam generator, where steam is produced to drive an electric generator. The water used as a coolant in the reactor and the water used to provide steam to the electric turbines exist in separate closed loops. Nuclear fuel fabrication for reactors consists of cylindrical rods which are placed inside of corrosion-resistant zircaloy tubes, which in turn are grouped into bundles. The zircaloy tubes are approximately ½ inch in diameter. Each bundle contains up to 264 fuel rods, and each reactor core contains up to 193 fuel bundles. The fuel rods have a common diameter of approximately 6 feet. But their lengths vary. They are typically grouped into bundles of 14 feet and enriched with uranium-235.
Well, I think one of the things that's important to think about is when you talk about radiation, you know that it has dangers. We're not too sure to what extent you're put at risk, but we know that there's risks with any kind of radiation. And when you go to the doctor, if you've injured yourself and you go to the doctor's office or the emergency room, they ask you to sign a release if they're going to do an x-ray. And I go into an emergency room. I know that radiation presents some risks, but I would probably sign that release if I had a very bad arm and I wanted to know it was broken. I would figure that it was worth signing the release and actually finding that out. Nobody's been asked to give permission to nuclear power, and there are other ways of making electricity, and I think of it, when you think about using radiation to boil water, to turn a turbine to make electricity, I think of it in household terms, like setting my table using a chainsaw instead of a butter knife to cut the butter.
People of the 21st century are beginning to warm to the idea of nuclear energy being a viable alternative. But there is no forgetting its dark beginnings or the subconscious fears the word nuclear triggers in us.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. That we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
In response to the surprise Japanese attack and decimation of the U.S. naval fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, scientists developed the ultimate vengeance weapon that used the process of nuclear fission to release energy. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested at the Trinity Test Site. It exploded 100 feet over the southern New Mexico desert, resulting in an explosion so powerful that observers 10 miles away witnessed it. Following the test, scientists set in motion an act to bring Japan to its knees and end the Holocaustic conflict with the detonation of 2 atomic bombs. Nicknamed the Fat Man and Little Boy, the 2 bombs were capable of immediately vaporizing tens of thousands of people. While the Fat Man used the man-made element of plutonium-239, the Little Boy used the natural occurring element uranium-235. The same element that is used to enrich nuclear fuel bundles for modern reactors. The Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became mass graveyards leveled by the atomic weapons America had created. Estimates put the death toll at well above 200,000. The Japanese city's legacy has not been forgotten as more peaceful uses of the atom were discovered. Because of the complexity and type of chemical reactions taking place, the nuclear reactor design must be flawless, and personnel must be adequately trained to prevent the unthinkable. One little mistake or misjudgment can lead to nuclear meltdowns that can breach reactor containment and release highly radioactive fission products into the environment. On March 28, 1979, there was a nuclear power plant accident at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in the vicinity of Middletown, Pennsylvania. Forever etched in the public's mind as the worst nuclear mishap in American history that resulted in a partial nuclear meltdown, the accident was caused by a combination of human error, faulty components, and flawed design. The incident fortunately did not cause any deaths. Yet, the pillars of the nuclear energy industry would soon be rocked to their foundation. On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant located in the former Soviet Union near Pripyat in the Ukraine exploded, causing a total nuclear meltdown. The death and destruction the event caused has come to symbolize the dangers of civilian nuclear energy. The Chernobyl accident emitted vast quantities of deadly radiation into the atmosphere. Nearby forests quickly were devastated and soils were inflicted with radiation. The invisible cloud of death eventually spread across the Soviet Union, Central Europe, Scandinavia, and afar. More than 100,000 people were forced to evacuate the city and nearby villages, abandoning their family homes and belongings to the radiation lurking in the air. This massive evacuation consumed an 18.6-mile range from the reactor. Today, human life in the exclusion zone is non-existent. Vegetation has taken over the streets, and the city is an image of absolute decay overtaken by silence, peril, and the occasional sound of wind blowing or stray dogs walking.
The nuclear plants are the only large-scale source of non-emitting electric generation. Fossil energy will continue to be a very important part. We will continue to use coal and natural gas and oil as a part of our energy mix, and we'll work hard to clean up those products so that they can generate electricity as cleanly as possible. But nuclear doesn't emit air pollutants and greenhouse gases that can lead to global warming.
During the past 100 years, the average surface temperature on our planet has risen 1 degree Fahrenheit, and it continues to climb. This doesn't sound like much, but the temperature increase already has had a large impact on the planet. There is no clearer sign of this impending disaster than with the receding glaciers around the world. The Earth's temperature rise is a man-made calamity caused by burning fossil fuels to generate electricity. But the world's insatiable need for power has continued to go unchecked, resulting in the production of heat-trapping gases that directly cause global warming. Trapped carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere cause a greenhouse effect, which in turn warms the Earth's surface. Along with glaciers around the world, global warming has caused the thickness of the Arctic ice to decrease approximately 40% since the 1950s. The decrease of the polar ice cap has triggered a rise in sea levels, resulting in beach erosion, coastal flooding, freshwater contamination, and has impacted food production around the world. It is predicted that by 2100, the sea level on the continental United States will have risen by 3 feet, consuming over 22,000 square miles of land along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. The days of coastal habitation are numbered.
Where we are today with global warming, there's a lot of obvious disagreement about how fast it is and what's causing it, but it's very clear that any bulk energy generation technology that can satisfy the country's energy needs without contributing to carbon emissions and global warming is a major plus and is, quite frankly, vital to the future of this country. Nuclear meets that need. Is nuclear the only solution? No. Does it need to be a part of the solution? Absolutely yes, in my opinion.
Nuclear energy plays a key role in other countries around the world. For example, in France, the French citizens get roughly 80% of their electricity from nuclear energy. We see China and India in their booming economies coming up with true economic development, relying more and more on nuclear energy. Russia, Europe, Eastern European, Western Europe, all use nuclear energy as a key component of their energy mix. So it's an important part of our world's energy supply, and as we go forward, I think will continue to be.
As of 2005, there are 104 nuclear generators that have been licensed by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to operate in 34 states. Spent nuclear fuel from these reactors is stored in above-ground vaults, cooling water pools, or dry concrete or steel casks. About 160 million Americans live within a 75-mile range from one of these storage facilities. Consequently, this is the chief argument for a repository to safely isolate highly radioactive nuclear waste for at least 10,000 years.
Right next to Richland, Washington is what's called the Hanford site, and the Hanford site has the largest concentration of high-level radioactive waste tanks. That's where the most tanks are located. Now, some of the tanks are leaking, and there's fear that the leaking material will make its way into the groundwater and then eventually into the Columbia River. Okay? There's a lot of danger in that. In fact, we don't know the magnitude of the danger of having high-level radioactive waste in our streams. High-level radioactive waste will burn our skin, burn our bodies. So think of it almost in terms of the danger of an atomic bomb.
In 1982, the United States Congress established the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to regulate the disposal of the nation's radioactive waste. Subsequently, the U.S. Department of Energy was put in charge of identifying a single location within the country that would satisfy the needs for a safe and secure geological repository. Initially, 3 sites in Texas, Washington, and Nevada were deemed plausible. Although all 3 sites had geological disadvantages, Nevada ultimately was selected despite opposition from residents and state leaders. Yucca Mountain sits on federally protected land and is located in Area 25 of the Nevada Test Site in Nye County, Nevada. In contrast, Yucca Mountain is some 40 miles southwest of the site's infamous Area 51, home to mysterious UFO legends and military weapon experiments. Larger than the state of Rhode Island, the Nevada Test Site is one of the biggest restricted access areas in the United States, consisting of approximately 1,375 square miles.
Well, basically, the Nevada Test Site is a large landmass that was used for testing of atomic weapons, both above ground and below ground. And for many years, it also had a rocket component where they tested rocket engines.
In 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was passed that instructed the Department of Energy to investigate sites around the country for the potential repository location. And then several sites were looked at. And in 1987, after looking at the initial surveys, the Congress suggested that only the Yucca Mountain site be characterized.
Yucca Mountain is surrounded by vast amounts of open space and mountainous ranges, making it seem ideal for the proposed excavation of geological waste tunnels. The main tunnel of the Yucca Mountain facility is U-shaped and currently hosts exploratory scientific experiments to support the validity of the site. It is 5 miles long and 25 feet wide, with numerous alcoves branching out. Following licensing approval, the facility constructed will cover 69 acres, which will include surface buildings and approximately 6 miles of underground ramps and tunnels. For more than 20 years, scientists have conducted numerous site characterization tests, some of which include surface-based testing and investigation, underground geologic mapping, and laboratory material testing and modeling. The repository system was designed based on the results of these studies. The nuclear waste canisters destined for Yucca Mountain consist of a waste package, drip shield and supporting structures. The waste is stored in double-layered canisters, an outer canister crafted out of corrosion-resistant metal and an inner canister constructed of stainless steel. A pendant drip shield is made out of titanium. This shield provides additional protection to the waste container, preventing water from dripping inside the containers, and it also serves as a barrier to falling rocks.
It's very important that we have an ultimate repository for the final waste products from the generation of electricity using nuclear energy.
The thought a long time ago was the people in Nevada will not have a problem with this because they've already put up with bomb testing. They've had bombs exploding, so how can they possibly be opposed to something where we just quietly bring in nuclear waste and put it in a mountain? But that was a bad argument. And one of the reasons that it was a faulty argument was because the testing at the Nevada test site was national defense, and a dump at Yucca Mountain is just doing a favor for a commercial industry.
Because I believe so strongly that nuclear has to be part of the energy solution, the question of what you do with the spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste has to be solved.
The test site is no stranger to nuclear experiments. From 1951 to 1992, the site served as America's nuclear proving grounds, where some 928 atmospheric and underground nuclear tests took place. In a 1997 report by the National Cancer Institute, it was determined that the atmospheric tests at the Nevada test site were directly responsible for more than 10,000 cases of thyroid cancer.
There was an experiment done at the Nevada test site in 1978 in which they did a similar experiment to what we're talking about now of burying fuel rods. This, I believe, is documented and can be found in some of the DOE records, but basically the test, as I recall, was a success. Or the experiment, I should say. It wasn't a test, it was an experiment. Therefore, I look at Yucca Mountain and I see that, I think that, in my opinion, my humble opinion, the Yucca Mountain could be used as a successful storage of fuel rods.
There are a considerable number or amounts of not spent fuel, not high-level waste, but low-level waste at the Nevada test site. And that's being safely stored, primarily from military sites around the country. And there have been some instances in past brief tests and historically where some high-level waste was brought in.
The Nevada test site is already home to radioactive waste. Located on Area 5 of the test site, low-level waste is currently stored in underground tanks and vaults. This reserved zone covers 95 square miles and serves as the radioactive waste management site for storage and disposal of government waste materials. The Department of Energy is currently working with many national and international agencies, groups, and organizations in order to implement safe and effective security measures for waste storage facilities. The security evolution that took place post 9/11 will undoubtedly be reflected at Yucca Mountain following construction.
There are, I think, 103 reactors around the country. There are, I think, 36 or 38 states where it's being held. In many instances, it's not in as nearly secure an environment as it would be at Yucca Mountain. It's sitting in pools. It's being held in dry cask storage. It's in multiple locations, which means in this day and age, thinking in terms of the terrorist realities, means multiple targets. So it makes good sense to put it all in one place, 1,000 feet underground, 1,000 feet above the water table, 100 miles from town, and next to an Air Force base. There's no better place that anybody can conceive of to put it than there.
Yucca Mountain is one of the best ways for us to store high-level radioactive waste, whether it be Yucca Mountain or someplace else. The whole concept is that we've got to do something with the high-level radioactive waste that's being stored in these large tanks. And right now they're being stored underground. And the tanks are starting to leak. In fact, they've been leaking for over a decade.
Part of the Great Basin Desert, Yucca Mountain is poor in vegetation and arid. Area rainfalls accumulate approximately 6.8 inches of rain a year. The rocks covering the terrain are said to be at least 11 million years old. There are several faults located under or near the repository, including the Bow Ridge, Ghost Dance, and Sundance faults. Despite these geological shortcomings, this highly controlled and monitored location has, at the moment, been depicted by the U.S. government as the most suitable location for the storage of radioactive materials for at least 10,000 years. Nevada state leaders argue otherwise. Although scientists are still assessing the terrain's suitability for such storage, government agencies are pressing for the project's license approval so the excavations of waste storage tunnels can begin at a full force.
I think Yucca Mountain was chosen just by default. The country began looking for a place. They started a site selection process. They began looking throughout the United States at sites. And each time people were faced with the issue of, do you want to be a high-level nuclear dump site? They rose up and said no. And as the more politically strong places were able, the places with higher populations were able to get themselves out of this dilemma, the search kept moving to places that seemed easy. The geology sort of fell out of the issue, and the question began, where can we find a place where we're able to do this?
From a standpoint of public health and safety, the repository has gone through an extensive scientific evaluation, the site itself. Over 20 years, several $billion, and all of the science being looked at. And talking about all of the science, that's the seismology, hydrology, geology, volcanology, all of the things that look at and determine whether the site would be suitable. And that determination was made in 2002 and upheld by our Congress.
Yucca Mountain is undoubtedly no stranger to controversy, so it is only fitting that its past is shrouded in violent volcanic eruptions which spewed out ash that hardened over millions of years to form a volcanic tuff. And although government scientists acknowledge the numerous faults in volcanic aquifers around Yucca Mountain, they contend that a recurrence of volcanism in the area is unlikely. Not all geologists agree.
Well, Yucca Mountain is made up of volcanic ash that has been solidified into rock. And it formed was formed from ash flows between about 9 and 12 million years ago. That type of volcanism stopped in that area at about that time. But since then, there has been a recurrence of another type of volcanism. And from standing on the top of Yucca Mountain, you can look down to the base of Yucca Mountain to the south. You see a cinder cone, a volcanic cone, that appears to have last erupted on the order of about 70,000 years ago, which is very young geologic time. You can look out into Crater Flat from the top of Yucca Mountain and see a few more volcanic cones that are on the order of 1 million to maybe 1.5 million years old. Now, there are others from geophysics. There are other volcanic cones that are buried under the alluvium in the valley, and you can see cones sort of spread around in Crater Flat. The recurrence of volcanism in this area is not out of the question. That the particular young cone suggests that recurrence is something that needs to at least be looked at. So the way it's looked at for Yucca Mountain, instead of doing the logical thing, which is say that, hey, we have very young volcanism in this area, maybe we shouldn't be here. Instead, what they're saying is we need to try to figure out the probability of a recurrence of volcanism that will impact Yucca Mountain.
Government scientists have identified a dozen volcanoes within 12 miles of Yucca Mountain. The results of their geological studies indicate a 1 in 7,000 chance of a volcanic eruption in the area during a 10,000-year period. Opponents argue the risk is too high.
What we have done to try and properly characterize the site and the potential risk and probability of volcanic activity at the site for long into the future is that we've pulled together the foremost experts on volcanism that we can find. And by using them and what's called a peer elicitation process, expert elicitation process, excuse me, to bring these experts together and have them take a look at the geology of the site, the movement of the plates in the area. They're using that expert knowledge. They've come up with models and predictions of what the probabilities are of volcanic events at that site, both in the near term and in the long term. And those probabilities are factored into the risk analysis, the long-term risk analysis that we have to do in order to be able to get a license to build a repository out there.
On September 27, 2006, a public forum was held by the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board in Amargosa Valley, Nevada. The board provides independent scientific oversight for the proposed repository and tackles points of contention, including those surrounding the geology.
The other thing is that there's always talk about the deep underground repository. And I think it's interesting for you to note that when you walk outside of this building and you're standing out there, either in back or in front, the repository is 1,000 feet over your head. So that's something that people understand, but often gets lost in this because it's like you're putting it underground where it's halfway between here and hell, if you believe in that.
5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll know that uncertainty range will be a little bit smaller. 100 years from now, that uncertainty range will be even smaller. But where we are today is where we are. So we need to put a stake in the ground and say, here's our design based on what we know, and this is the way we're going to go forward. And then based on what we learn in the future, we may in fact make changes, probably in the design of the waste packages. There's science gaps, the gaps between what the science program has determined and what the engineering program is utilizing as design bases. And there's a couple examples. My favorite is volcanism. Just to give you an idea of how small that probability is, it's about the same probability of mass extinction of all life on the Earth. So it's a pretty low probable event. Right? Most people would say it's not credible. The gap between there and engineering is, so do you design for that? And you put magma dams in your repository? My answer is no, you don't. You don't design for that. It's not part of your design basis.
What they're trying to do is be able to demonstrate that the probability is so low that it doesn't matter. And so far, they're not convincing anybody except maybe themselves. And they're also trying to show that the consequence doesn't matter. You know, if they're wrong and the probability, or if nature defeats their probability analysis, and you do have volcanic activity, there are two possible effects. One is that it remains within the rock, and what's referred to as a dike of molten rock hits the repository, but doesn't erupt out of the mountain. It just, molten rock gets into the repository tunnels with the waste. The other alternative is that it does erupt out through the top of Yucca Mountain after it has contacted the waste. What they're trying to show is that at least in the case where it doesn't erupt out of the mountain, it isn't really going to make any difference. They're saying that yes, it will destroy a few waste containers, you'll get some waste released, but it won't really be any worse in terms of the long-term contamination of the groundwater than the condition if it hadn't happened. That's their estimate. They're trying to make people believe that.
Yeah, Yucca Mountain is very safe from a seismology and a volcanism standpoint. It's been tens of thousands of years since anything moved out there. You know, I think 80,000 years or something like that. When you think how long that is, I mean, you think Christ walked on the earth 2,000 years ago, and we're talking, you know, tens of thousands of years, and And of course, they have to think forward 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, you know? It's almost inconceivable to think in terms of those sorts of time references.
If you have molten rock that erupts up through the repository, it's going to, the word they use is entrain a lot of the waste, meaning waste from destroyed containers is going to get caught up in what's being ejected out of that volcano, meaning it's going to be in the ash, it's going to be in the gases, it's going to be in some of the molten material, and that's susceptible to being blown around by the wind and covering a large area.
Some 1,300 residents live only 15 miles from Yucca Mountain in Amargosa Valley. This sleepy little community is home to some of Nevada's largest dairies that produce 20% of the state's milk. More than 128 million pounds of milk products are shipped annually to 30 million people throughout the West Coast. Opponents of the repository argue that any accident or geological event at Yucca Mountain could cause a breach of the waste containers, which in turn could contaminate the underground aquifers used by the people, livestock, and crops of the area with nuclear waste.
The big question always comes back for me anyway, and that's if you were in the area, you saw these volcanic cones, why would you ever think it could be compatible with the long-term disposal of nuclear waste?
The magma that is underneath those old ancient volcano cones has not moved up. We know a lot more today about volcanism than we've ever known before. The monitoring of the live volcanoes that are still around. This is a dead volcano field. From an earthquake standpoint, there have been earthquakes out there, and the interesting thing is they sort of rattle what's on top, but they make virtually no impact down below.
Whether or not Yucca Mountain is the appropriate site for a repository, it is a moot point because back in 2002, the Department of Energy recommended to the President accepted, and both houses of Congress approved Yucca Mountain as the site for the National High-Level Waste Repository.
During his presidential campaign in 2000, then Texas Governor George W. Bush promised, if elected, sound science would go into determining the safety of the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository. Most Nevadans took that as Bush's pledge to shut down the project. 2 years later, and after winning a disputed presidential election, President Bush signed House Joint Resolution 87, allowing the U.S. Department of Energy to move forward with the repository. In the meantime, the federal government and the state of Nevada have continuously battled in the courts the science, legalities, and politics of Yucca Mountain. Most of the lawsuits pertain to the environmental impact of the selected location originally set up by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Although the state's lawyers valiantly argued over the proximity to the Las Vegas Valley, the groundwater contamination standards and other health and safety regulations, the court sided with the federal government on all of the issues, except one. The court found that the EPA's 10,000-year limit on the safety of the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository did not extend far enough into the future. The Yucca Mountain project was stopped, dead in its tracks. Or was it?
The thing of significance is that the court did find for the state and some public interest groups that the Environmental Protection Agency's safety standard was illegal. And it was illegal in the sense that it set a compliance period for maintaining that safety standard at 10,000 years. Given the geologic setting at Yucca Mountain, it was reasonable to make this type of a calculation for out to about 1 million years from present.
So EPA simply has gone back and proposed a new regulation which takes it out to 10,000 and on out to 1 million years. So they just simply had to adopt a different regulation. So state didn't stop anything. They didn't in effect have any kind of a major victory. A thing that is I think way too often overlooked is that this material isn't just going to be stuffed in there and covered up with dirt and forgotten. The idea is it's going to be monitored and it's going to be retrievable. And by being monitored, they'll know exactly what's going on with it. It isn't just going to be a hope and a prayer that nothing happens.
The law requires us that once we get the license to build a repository and we start emplacing spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste into it, and we expect that process to take between 50 and 75 years before everything is emplaced in the mountain. During that period of time, we have to maintain the capability of pulling everything back out. If something happens or we discover from our data that the site isn't as stable as we thought it was, or that the geology isn't acting the way we predicted it would back in 2007.
Although Nevadans watch the controversial repository with great interest, another group contends it has more of a legal right to the land than the Department of Energy.
Yucca Mountain, a nuclear waste repository aside, is within the borders of the Western Shoshone Nation. The Western Shoshone Nation is a sovereign state recognized by the United States of America through the Treaty of Ruby Valley in 1863. Yucca Mountain is within the borders of that nation, and those borders are specifically defined in the treaty. Articles of the treaty allow the United States certain privileges within our territory, and storage of nuclear waste is definitely not one of them.
The Treaty of Ruby Valley was signed in 1863 to protect the tribal lands of the Western Shoshone while granting certain privileges to the United States government. Today, the Western Shoshone are in a bitter dispute with the federal government over their lands that stretch throughout much of Nevada. In 1979, the U.S. Congress attempted to settle the dispute by offering to purchase 24 million acres of the tribal lands for a mere $26 million. The tribe refused the token payment. Seeking to have the treaty enforced so as to stop the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository project and keep the sacred land free of nuclear waste, the Western Shoshone National Council filed a lawsuit in the Federal District Court in Las Vegas, Nevada on March 4, 2005.
As a sovereign nation, we are trying to negotiate with the State Department, which is very reluctant to deal with an Indian tribe or an Indian nation. As you know, treaties, be they with Indian nations or with foreign nations, are, as described in the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. And for Indian nations to get the United States to uphold those treaties is very, very rough.
Nevada's had a long-standing sort of love-hate relationship with the federal government. Government owns nearly 90% of the land in Nevada, and it's just been a dominant absentee landlord of our state. It's affected every industry in Nevada. Going back to the old days, miners couldn't just go out and buy a piece of land if they found gold on it. They had to deal with the federal government. They had to file claims and all of this. And so there was it's always been very difficult. The ranchers have to go to the federal government, to the BLM, to get grazing rights. The gaming industry has had long-standing running battles with the Internal Revenue Service over how their employees are treated. Sportsmen who want to go out and hunt and fish on public lands find that sometimes they can't do it. And our communities are constrained for growth because they're all landlocked with federal land around them.
The Treaty of Ruby Valley does not cede land, merely allows the United States to cross our territory and certain privileges. So the United States now is in a position that they are allowing mining on a grand scale, the nuclear waste repository. The gold mining alone is highly invasive to our land. So it comes down to money. To recognize the treaty and to uphold it would mean a great loss of value.
Currently, there is no permanent site in the United States for storing spent nuclear fuel. Housed at temporary storage facilities, these spent fuel rods are extremely hot. To cool down, they are placed in cooling pools filled with boric acid, which helps to absorb some of the radiation from the rods. Due to a lack of a permanent storage facility, fuel rods stay in the pools for years, even though they should only be placed there for about 6 months. As more and more spent fuel rods are immersed in these pools, the likelihood of a nuclear chain reaction increases. A permanent disposal facility where the spent nuclear fuel can be permanently housed is extremely overdue.
One of the public relations things that goes on with people when the nuclear industry is trying to tell you shouldn't worry about transportation is they'll say, why do you worry about nuclear waste being on the roads and on the rails? You've already got things out there like gasoline traveling and chlorine and many of the things that can explode or are very, very dangerous, deadly, poisonous. And that's a silly argument because we don't get a choice. We don't get to say, all right, the highways should just carry nuclear waste and not these other things. It compounds the problem because you're adding a radioactive element to these other things that can explode. So you might have a huge explosion that involves nuclear waste and involves something that's very flammable or explosive, or you might have radiation added to another poison when you get a cloud coming off of a train that's crashed or a big truck accident.
Transportation associated with this program is a area of concern for a lot of people. What I think most people don't recognize is that spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste has been transported long distances in this country over many years, and internationally it's also being transported very safely, very reliably over long distance for many years. So it's not like this hasn't been done before.
The preferred method is to transport this material by rail because you can carry more with a larger weight by rail than you can by truck. Some material will go by truck, undoubtedly, from some plant locations to rail yards and then be transferred to a rail car. The Department of Energy has also recommended and has stated their preference that they would use dedicated trains so that they can be expedited through the rail yards and through the rail lines around the country.
Spent nuclear fuel rods are enclosed in the center of a shipping container consisting of a stainless steel inner canister and a stainless steel outer storage cask. Inside the casks, there is a fuel rod basket surrounded by an inner steel shell, lead gamma shielding, outer steel shell, neutron shielding, and neutron shielding shell. On one end of the casket there is an impact limiter, and on the other there is a closure lid. All these layers create a radiation shielding and ensure safer transportation. There are about 2 feet of concrete between the inner and outer steel shells. Rail casks weigh between 100 and 165 tons and are approximately 27 feet long and 11 feet in diameter. Truck casks, when used, weigh approximately 24 tons and are 16 feet long and 4 to 5 feet in diameter. The casks have been certified by the NRC to endure accidents, impact, puncture, and exposure to fire, water, and high temperatures.
The casks that we use today have gone through various rigorous testing by the Sandia National Laboratories. They've been hit by locomotives going over 80 miles an hour, broadsided, while maybe sustaining some outside damage, have not been breached in the way that any radiation would leak from those casks.
We are required to work with the states, with the counties, and with the local authorities to figure out exactly how and when all of that material will actually get transferred and transported from those remote sites to Yucca Mountain. Some will be by truck, some will be by rail. But it's a very long, involved process of which there's a lot of public participation in the planning of that transportation process. But that will take place over the next 10 years or so before the repository opens.
A repository anywhere affects us all. Again, we're talking initially 77,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste moving from every state in the nation to one location. One accident. One terrorist attack. It won't take much to contaminate for thousands of years very large portions of this country.
Most of the material that's being held right now is in close proximity to metropolitan areas. 75% of the people in America live closer to the used fuel where it currently sits than Las Vegas would be to Yucca Mountain.
The Geological Repository is already many years behind schedule. Further delays are likely with additional lawsuits and future licensing procedures. Yet, we are still faced with possibly the toughest question in human existence. Leave the spent nuclear fuel where it sits and hope future generations can find a better solution to our problem, or continue with the repository at Yucca Mountain and hope future generations are not affected by our waste.
Well, historically, of course, the material did belong entirely to, and was expected to always belong, to the private industry. There is, except for the military waste, about 15% of the spent fuel or the radioactive material that would go into Yucca Mountain actually comes from government agencies. 85% comes from private sector. Why does the federal government take responsibility for it? Because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act directed that federal government would take that responsibility and take ownership of it and be responsible to dispose of it or store it.
Today, as we generate electricity from nuclear plants around this country, a fee is charged to all of the generators. And that fee, it's a tenth of a cent per kilowatt hour, goes and is paid to the federal government. And today there's been some $23 billion in the Nuclear Waste Fund.
Unfortunately, because of budgetary legislation passed back in the 90s, this program no longer has access to that waste fund. And I won't go into all the details, but essentially that's $750 million a year that's coming into the federal government. Only a small portion of it gets allocated to Yucca Mountain, and the rest is used for other purposes. As a result, we are going to have trouble funding the construction of Yucca Mountain because those waste fees that the law says the government is supposed to collect to pay for this repository currently can't be used to pay for the building of the repository.
What Yucca Mountain may get you, or any site I guess at this point, is more nuclear waste. Because if Yucca Mountain is just there in order to be able to move waste away from the reactor sites so that you can build more reactors, then you're getting yourself more nuclear waste. And this is a discussion that needs to go on in the country. People need to decide, what kind of power do you want in the future? Do you want to look at renewables like wind and solar? Do you want more dependence on nuclear energy? And if you want more dependence on nuclear energy, how do you want to manage the waste problem?
Since the advent of modern industry, fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas have been used to generate electricity and have directly impacted the Earth's climate. By 2030, global energy consumption is expected to grow by over 50%. Although other emission-free renewable sources can be utilized, nuclear energy makes up 70% of the world's emission-free energy usage. In a strange twist of fate, nuclear is now considered green by some advocates, even in spite of such nuclear catastrophes as Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. In the United States alone, 98.2 million kilowatts of nuclear energy can be produced. No other nation has such a capacity.
The used nuclear fuel, as it is discharged from the nuclear power plant, actually is about 90 to 95% usable material, again. And other countries do recycle or reprocess this material to extract out usable uranium and plutonium that can be made into fuel again.
In France, for example, where a vast majority of their electricity comes from nuclear power, they're already recycling. They're recycling in Japan. They've recycled in England. There's recycling going on in lots of places. We've never done it in this country for the last 30 years or so, or even researched it, because there's been an executive order that precluded it for a simple reason, and that is, with today's technology, that being used in these other countries I speak of, you get a plutonium byproduct that comes out that's a weapons-grade material. And so in the interests of non-proliferation, a decision was made here in this country, originally by President Carter, to do no recycling.
Construction of the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Repository cannot begin until the Nuclear Regulatory Commission grants a license. Although the government believes the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will approve construction, that's still just the beginning. Having to comb through thousands of pages of technical data, the NRC is expected to take several years to complete its task. At this point, the project license endorsement is an if and when type issue, as the application must fully satisfy the NRC's licensing criteria and requirements. Eventually, the Department of Energy must obtain an operating license once the repository has been built, and far into the future, a license for closure and decommissioning when the nuclear casks have been safely packed away. For now, the tunnel boring machines used in the initial geological excavations of Yucca Mountain sit idle, rusting behemoths, victim to a bureaucratic process.
Well, the Department of Energy most recently announced a schedule that they would hope to file a license application for the Yucca Mountain project with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2008. And their schedule would be to then go forward with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's detailed review of that license application. That will take several years, and there will be public hearings here in Nevada on the license application with the hope that the construction could begin. The licensing period is expected to take 3 to 4 years, and then with construction being able to start after that and operation in the 2017 timeframe.
Obviously, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a betting person, so I can't really predict how successful this licensing process will be. What I can tell you is that I've got substantial nuclear licensing experience, and I've assembled a team here that also has substantial nuclear licensing experience. We brought in the top scientific and engineering people from across the country to work on this project with us. I believe we have a very, very strong technical case, a very strong legal case to move forward with getting a license, not only getting a license application submitted, but getting a license from the NRC to build and operate the repository.
The federal government being willing to try to force the state of Nevada to take this, whether it's safe or not, using every political trick they can think of, is an affront to democracy. No other state would want this. No other state would want what's happening to Nevada to happen to them. And states with more population and more representation probably would never have a chance to have this happen to them.
Many Nevadans have been just so hammered with misinformation about nuclear waste, alleged waste, and they simply have a fear of it. And it's sort of a Chinese water drop treatment. They've just been subjected to misinformation and exaggeration for so long that they don't understand it.
During the time of the bomb testing, people here and in Utah and in the Intermountain West were told, you don't have to worry. There's no danger involved with this. We're very careful. We wouldn't let you get hurt. Don't worry about it. And as all of us found out many years later, a lot of people died. A lot of people contracted illnesses. A lot of the animals became sick from the radiation that came off of the test site. So people really don't believe the Department of Energy when they say, don't worry, it's safe, you have nothing to be concerned about.
The average person in the United States is going to be affected by the Yucca Mountain project in different ways. Those on the East Coast are going to breathe a sigh of relief. Those on the West Coast are going to think, uh-oh, it's in my backyard. But what I think has to be thought of and conveyed to the public is this is a lot better than tanks leaking into our rivers.
The problem at Yucca Mountain is that it's political, not scientific. And I believe that basically in our society today, we try to make everything so it's 100% safe. And under no circumstances that possible.